In 1967, Esquire magazine put Sharon Tate on its cover and called her without hesitation the most beautiful woman in the world. That same year, a director who worked with her wrote privately that she had comic timing so instinctive, so effortlessly precise, that it came along maybe once in a decade. Esquire ran the cover. Nobody published the other thing. That is not an accident. That is a decision. And in Hollywood, decisions like that are made every single day, quietly, politely, and permanently. This is not a story about how Sharon Tate died. Every channel on the internet will tell you how she died. This is the story of what she was building before they took it from her. The career, the potential, the version of herself that Hollywood saw and chose to ignore. If you have been here before, you know what we do. If you are new, welcome. And I am sorry because this one is going to stay with you. Drop your location in the comments below. Where in the world are you watching this? And this is Sharon Tate's real story. She was born on January 24th, 1943, in Dallas, Texas. The first daughter of Colonel Paul James Tate, a United States Army intelligence officer, and his wife, Doris. A military family, disciplined, structured, always moving. Before Sharon Tate turned 16 years old, she had lived in 6 different cities. 6 cities, 6 schools. 6 sets of strangers to impress. 6 first days where everyone already knew each other, and she did not. Her family described her as shy, lacking self-confidence. The kind of girl who stood near the wall at parties and hoped nobody noticed her. But here's the thing about Sharon Tate that nobody in Hollywood ever wanted to talk about. She was impossible not to notice, not because she demanded attention, not because she was loud or bold or electric in the way that future stars are supposed to be, but because she walked into a room and something shifted. The air changed. People turned their heads before they even understood why. She was 6 months old the first time it happened officially. 6 months old when her parents entered her into the Miss Tiny Tot of Dallas pageant, and she won. They had no show business ambitions for their daughter. It was not the beginning of a plan. It was just a fact about Sharon Tate that the world kept confirming over and over again, whether she asked for it or not. She was beautiful. And that beauty arrived before she had any say in the matter. Growing up, she learned to carry it the way you carry something fragile and slightly dangerous, carefully, quietly, hoping it would not define the entire conversation before she had a chance to speak. It always did. By the time the family was stationed in Verona, Italy, Sharon was a teenager navigating a foreign country, a foreign language, and the particular loneliness of a girl who has never been anywhere long enough to call it home. She started doing local modeling work. Catalog shoots, small advertisements, the kind of work that pays just enough to feel like independence. She was not chasing fame. She was filling time in a city where she knew almost no one. But something was happening underneath the surface of those catalog shoots and beauty pageant wins. Something that would take years to name. Every time Sharon Tate stepped in front of a camera, the camera looked back at her face and stopped. It did not look further. It did not ask what she was thinking, what she found funny, what made her laugh, until she had to leave the room. It just looked at her face, and she let it. Because at 16, in a foreign city, with no roots and no community and no history anywhere, being seen for something was better than not being seen at all. That is the first wound. Not poverty, not violence, not the dramatic trauma that origin stories are supposed to contain. Just a girl who learned, very early and very quietly, that her face was the only currency anyone wanted to accept. In 1961, she was 18 years old and newly arrived in Los Angeles when producer Martin Ransohoff spotted her at a party. He signed her to a 7-year contract with Filmways Productions. 7 years. She was 18. She had no leverage, no lawyer she trusted, no one in that city who had known her longer than a few months. She signed. The contract gave Ransohoff significant control over her public image. When she spoke to the press, what she wore, when she was ready to be introduced to the public. He was building a product. He was deciding, with the calm authority of a man who had done this before, what Sharon Tate would mean to the world. She was not consulted on the question. In those early years, she took the small roles she was given, bit parts in television, background work, the occasional featured scene that went nowhere. She watched other actors on set and she studied. She took acting classes seriously in the way that people take things seriously when they are not sure they are allowed to want them. Because Sharon Tate did want it. Not the fame, not the covers, not the word beautiful attached to her name in every sentence ever written about her. She wanted to act. She wanted to find out what she was capable of when someone finally handed her a real scene, a real character, a real set of emotional stakes and said, "Show me what you have got." Nobody was handing her that scene yet. They were handing her lighting and camera angles and carefully worded press releases about how breathtaking she looked on a Tuesday afternoon. She took the classes anyway. She kept showing up to set and watching and learning and waiting for the moment someone would look past the obvious thing and ask the less obvious question. She waited longer than she should have had to. And then, in 1966, a difficult, brilliant, deeply particular director named Roman Polanski walked onto a film set in London and looked at Sharon Tate for the first time. He did not say she was beautiful. He was watching her work. Roman Polanski was not an easy man to impress. He had survived things that most people in Hollywood could not imagine. Born in Paris, raised in Krakow, he had lived through the Nazi occupation of Poland as a child, lost his mother to Auschwitz, and clawed his way through post-war Europe on instinct and talent alone. By the time he arrived in London to direct The Fearless Vampire Killers in 1966, he was already considered one of the most uncompromising filmmakers of his generation. He did not hire actresses because they were beautiful. He hired them because they could do something. When Sharon Tate was cast in the film, Polanski was skeptical. She had the look of someone the studio had decided was useful, which in his experience meant she had probably been told her whole career exactly what to do and exactly how to stand, and exactly which angle made her cheekbones photograph best. He had worked with those actresses before. It was not a conversation. It was a transaction. But then Sharon Tate started working, and something happened on that set that nobody had quite anticipated. She was funny, not performed funny, not the kind of comic energy that announces itself and waits for applause. She had timing, the instinct for exactly how long to hold a beat before the joke landed, exactly when to undercut a moment with something small and unexpected. It was the rarest kind of comedy because it looked effortless, and effortless comedy is almost always the product of a very specific kind of intelligence. Polanski noticed. He adjusted scenes around what he was seeing. He gave her more room to work. By the end of production, he was in love with her. And for the first time in Sharon Tate's professional life, the most important person on set was paying attention to what she could do, not only to what she looked like. It was intoxicating. It was also, in ways that would take years to fully understand, the beginning of something more complicated than either of them knew. They became a couple. Then, in January 1969, they became husband and wife, in a ceremony in London that the press covered extensively. The headlines called it a fairy tale. The most beautiful woman in Hollywood marrying one of the most brilliant directors in the world. Nobody wrote about what she was building separately from him. But between 1966 and 1969, Sharon Tate made a series of films that, taken together, tell a completely different story than the one Hollywood was selling. Valley of the Dolls arrived in 1967 and made her famous in the way that Hollywood knows how to make women famous. The film was a melodrama about beautiful women destroyed by the entertainment industry. Sharon played Jennifer North, a woman whose career and sense of self are slowly dismantled by forces she cannot control. Critics noticed her. The audience noticed her. But what they noticed was the face, the presence, the quality of sadness she brought to a role that did not ask her for much beyond looking lost and luminous at the same time. She gave them more than they asked for. Almost nobody mentioned that at the time. The same year, she appeared in Don't Make Waves with Tony Curtis, a comedy, a light, fast, deliberately absurd comedy about nothing in particular. And on that set, without the weight of melodrama to lean on, something in Sharon Tate opened up completely. She was loose and quick and genuinely, surprisingly hilarious. Her instincts were flawless. Tony Curtis, who had worked with some of the great comic performers of his generation, later spoke about her timing with a kind of quiet respect that said more than the words themselves. In 1968, she made The Wrecking Crew with Dean Martin. More comedy, more evidence. Film critic Leonard Maltin, writing years later, called Don't Make Waves and The Wrecking Crew the two best performances of her career, and the clearest indicators of the kind of actress she was becoming. He wrote that after she was gone. At the time, the posters for both films showed her face. The reviews mentioned her appearance before they mentioned her performance. The industry that had made her famous was doing what it had always done, which was to take the most obvious thing about a person and repeat it so many times that the obvious thing became the only thing. In the summer of 1968, Sharon Tate was pregnant with her first child. She and Polanski were renting a house on Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon, Los Angeles. It was a beautiful house, high above the city, surrounded by trees, with a view that made the rest of the world feel far away. She was finishing her last film. She was waiting for her husband to come home. She was 26 years old, and the best work of her life was still ahead of her. She was so certain of that. She had every reason to be. There is a particular kind of erasure that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a confrontation or a contract clause or a powerful man slamming his hand on a desk. It arrives slowly, in the accumulated weight of small decisions made by other people about who you are allowed to be. It arrives in the gap between what you know about yourself and what the world is willing to print. Sharon Tate lived inside that gap for her entire career, and by the summer of 1969, the gap had become very wide indeed. The first layer of the story belongs to the system itself. Hollywood in the 1960s operated on a set of unwritten rules about women that were so thoroughly embedded in the industry structure that most of the men enforcing them never had to think about them consciously. Beautiful actresses were a specific category of asset. They were marketed, positioned, and deployed according to a logic that had nothing to do with what they were capable of and everything to do with what audiences had already been trained to want from them. Sharon Tate had been inside that system since she was 18 years old and signed a contract she had no real power to negotiate. Martin Ransohoff, the producer who discovered her, operated with the calm certainty of a man who had built careers before and understood exactly which parts of a person were commercially useful. He controlled her access to the press. He decided when she was ready to be seen publicly and in what context. There is an interview Sharon gave in the mid-1960s where she is poised and careful and says almost nothing of any substance, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had been prepared for that interview the way a product is prepared for a launch. She knew it, too. In a rare moment of candor, she told a friend that she sometimes felt like she was watching someone else give the interview, a version of herself that had been edited down to the parts other people found useful. That version was beautiful and agreeable and never said anything that complicated the story. The real Sharon Tate was reading Thomas Hardy novels and leaving them for her husband with notes in the margins about why they would make extraordinary films. She was studying directors she admired, asking questions on set that went beyond her own scenes, absorbing the technical architecture of filmmaking with the focused curiosity of someone who intended to be around the industry for a very long time. She was preparing for a career that the industry had not yet decided to give her. Every time she pushed toward something more challenging, the response was the same: polite, efficient, redirecting. There was always another project that needed her specific qualities, which meant her face, her presence, the particular way she occupied a frame. The serious dramatic roles, the complex characters, the work that would have required Hollywood to update its understanding of who Sharon Tate was, those conversations went nowhere. Not because she lacked talent. The people making those decisions knew she had talent. Some of them had seen it directly on set and said nothing useful about it in public. It was simpler than malice. It was economics. The Sharon Tate that sold magazines and filled theaters was a specific and reliable product. Changing the product meant taking a risk on an audience that had not asked for anything different. In Hollywood, that calculation has ended more careers than failure ever has. The second layer of the story is harder to talk about because it involves a man she loved. Roman Polanski was not a villain in Sharon Tate's life. That is important to say clearly. He loved her in the complicated and imperfect way that very driven people love the people they choose. But love does not exist outside of power structures, and the power structure inside their marriage was not equal. When they met, he was the director and she was the actress. When they married, the industry's memory of that original dynamic did not disappear. In press coverage, in industry conversations, in the way their relationship was framed publicly, Polanski was always the subject of the sentence, and Sharon was always the object. She became, in the language of 1960 Hollywood, a director's wife. That is not nothing. In certain circles, it was its own kind of status. But for Sharon Tate, who had spent her entire career trying to be seen as something more than a beautiful face, trading that particular invisibility for a different one was not progress. It was a lateral move inside the same locked room. Polanski's work took him everywhere: London, Paris, Rome. Sharon followed or waited or joined him briefly before returning to Los Angeles. Their life together was conducted largely across long distances, held together by phone calls and letters, and the shared understanding that his career required a kind of mobility that hers was expected to accommodate. She accommodated it. In the letters and calls from the final months of her life, the ones that have been documented and quoted by biographers, there is a tenderness that is also unmistakably a kind of longing. She missed him. She wanted him home. She was 8.5 months pregnant in a rented house in Benedict Canyon, and she was counting the days. He was in London, working. He kept extending the stay. She kept saying she understood. The third layer is the one that arrives on the night of August 8th, 1969, and it requires a different kind of telling. That evening, Sharon Tate had dinner at El Coyote, a Mexican restaurant on Beverly Boulevard that she loved. She went with 3 friends: Jay Sebring, her former boyfriend and one of the most sought-after hairstylists in Hollywood, who had remained one of her closest friends after their relationship ended; Wojciech Frykowski, a Polish writer and a friend of Polanski's; Abigail Folger, coffee heiress and Frykowski's girlfriend. It was a warm evening, the kind of Los Angeles summer night that feels like it could go on forever. Sharon was wearing a white dress. She was laughing. Witnesses at the restaurant remembered her as relaxed and happy. A woman who was tired of being pregnant and excited about what came next. She talked about the baby. She talked about Polanski coming home. She talked about the future the way people talk about things they are absolutely certain of. They left the restaurant around 10 in the evening and drove back up to Cielo Drive. She had asked Roman, in one of their last conversations, to please come home soon. She had told him she did not want to be alone much longer. He had told her he would be back before the baby came. The baby was due in 2 weeks. Inside the house that night, Sharon Tate was not thinking about Hollywood or contracts or the career she was still fighting to be taken seriously in. She was thinking about her son. She had already decided to name him Paul, after her father. She had no way of knowing that 4 people had parked a car at the bottom of Cielo Drive. She had no way of knowing that a man named Charles Watson had been told to go to that address and destroy everyone inside. She had no way of knowing that the address had been chosen not because of anything she had done or anyone she was, but because of who had lived there before her. The wrong house, the wrong night. A series of coincidences so arbitrary and so permanent that they defy every narrative logic that human beings use to make sense of the world. She begged for 2 weeks, just 2 weeks to have her son, and then they could do whatever they wanted with her. She offered herself as a hostage. She tried every leverage she had. It was not enough. Sharon Tate was 26 years old. She was 8.5 months pregnant. She was funnier than Hollywood ever let you know, smarter than the contracts she signed, more prepared for the career ahead of her than the industry was prepared to give her. She never got to prove any of it. And Hollywood, which had spent years deciding what Sharon Tate was allowed to be, spent the decades that followed remembering her almost exclusively as the thing she never wanted to be defined by: a victim. In the months after Sharon Tate was murdered, something quietly uncomfortable happened inside the Hollywood machine that had spent years deciding she was primarily a face. People started watching her films again. Not the way audiences had watched them the first time, with the casual pleasure of someone consuming a product designed for easy consumption. They watched differently now, slower, with the particular attention that grief and guilt tend to produce in people who realize too late that they were not paying close enough attention before. And what they found was not what the posters had promised. Leonard Maltin, one of the most respected film critics of his generation, went back to Don't Make Waves and The Wrecking Crew and wrote about what he saw with a directness that carried its own quiet accusation. He called those two performances the clearest evidence of the career Sharon Tate had been building. He described her comic timing as natural and precise in equal measure, the kind of instinct that cannot be taught and rarely survives contact with an industry that does not know what to do with it. He wrote all of that after she was gone. The film, 12+1, her final completed performance, was released in 1970. She had finished shooting it in Italy just weeks before returning to Los Angeles for the last time. Critics who reviewed it noted something different in her work, a maturity and a confidence that suggested an actress who had finally stopped waiting for permission to take up space. It was her most fully realized screen performance. It opened in theaters 11 months after her death. The Hollywood that had politely redirected her ambitions for the better part of a decade responded to her absence the way it responds to most things it has undervalued, with retrospective appreciation that costs nothing and changes nothing, or with profiles and tributes that described her potential in the same breath as her beauty, as though the two had always been considered equally important, as though the industry had not spent years making very deliberate choices about which one to emphasize. The erasure continued in a different form. For decades following August 1969, the name Sharon Tate existed in the public imagination almost entirely inside the story of Charles Manson. She became a footnote in someone else's narrative. The true crime genre, which expanded enormously in the years and then the decades after the murders, returned to the case again and again. Books, documentaries, television series, podcasts, all of them circled the same events, the same address, the same terrible night. Almost none of them asked the question she had spent her whole career trying to get someone to ask. What was she capable of? In 2019, Quentin Tarantino released Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, a film that made a deliberate and in many ways generous attempt to restore Sharon Tate to something resembling a full human being. Margot Robbie played her as joyful and alive, a woman moving through her own life with pleasure and presence. There is a scene where Sharon slips into a movie theater to watch herself on screen, and the delight on her face is so uncomplicated and so real that it lands like a small correction to 50 years of received narrative. It was a kind gesture from a filmmaker who clearly understood the injustice. But the film is still fundamentally the story of two men navigating the edges of that world. Sharon moves through it beautifully, radiantly, on the periphery of someone else's plot. Even in the most sympathetic reimagining Hollywood has yet produced, she remains slightly to the side of the center. Some patterns are very difficult to break. What remains underneath the true crime mythology and the retrospective praise and the gentle cinematic tributes is a question with no comfortable answer. Sharon Tate was 26 years old, and she was getting better. The evidence is there in the films if you watch them honestly. The timing was sharpening. The instincts were deepening. She was reading Hardy and leaving notes for her husband about stories worth telling. She was thinking about what came next. She had every reason to believe that next was going to be extraordinary. The question that her story leaves behind is not really about her. It is about the system that surrounded her and the habits of attention that system produces. How many times does a woman have to demonstrate something before the people with the power to confirm it decide to look? How many performances does she have to give before the review stops leading with her appearance? And the question underneath that question, the one that does not have a clean answer and was never meant to, how many women are we doing this to right now, today, in the same industry, with the same logic and the same polite and permanent redirections? Sharon Tate never got her answer. We are still working on ours. If you made it here to the very end of this story, then you already know that this was never really a video about a murder. It was a video about a woman who wanted to be seen for the right reasons, in an industry that had very specific ideas about which reasons were acceptable. It was about the distance between who someone is and who the world decides to let them be. And it was about the particular cruelty of a system that withholds recognition until it no longer matters to the person who deserved it. Sharon Tate deserved it while she was alive. I want to ask you something before you go. Think about the women working in film and television right now, today, in 2024. Think about the ones whose names you know primarily because of how they look. Think about whether you have ever read a profile of an actress that led with her appearance before it led with her work. Think about whether that felt normal, because it probably did. Because it has been normal for so long that most of us stopped noticing. Sharon Tate's story is not ancient history. It is a pattern, and patterns only break when enough people decide to start paying attention differently. So here's what I want you to do. Leave a comment below and tell me the name of an actress working at any point in Hollywood history who you believe never received the recognition her talent deserved. I want to read every single one of those names. I want this comment section to become a record of everything the industry got wrong. And if this video made you feel something, if it changed the way you think about a story you thought you already knew, please share it. That is how these stories survive. That is how the women inside them get remembered correctly. Like this video, if you stayed until the end, subscribe if you want to keep asking the uncomfortable questions with me. There is another story coming very soon, and I promise you it is one you have never heard told this way before. Thank you for being here. Thank you for paying attention.